I am Urva Singh. On behalf of TERI, extend a warm welcome to all of you and invite you to today's enriching discussion. As we celebrate 50 years of our journey, we are pleased to present to you all TERI's discussion paper titled India's Journey to Net Zero, a Conceptual Framework for Analysis. The paper proposes a conceptual framework for analyzing the transition to net zero in electricity, transport, industry, agriculture, and residential cooking, emphasizing the importance of decoupling emissions from growth. With this, I call upon stage the Director General of TERI, Dr. Vibha, to give the welcome address.
Thank you so much, and welcome to all of you. The topic which we are going to discuss today, India's journey to net zero, that is something I suppose it's at the back of our mind all the time. Whether it is the scorching heat that we are facing today, or it's the floods, it's anything that exceptional, which is more or less become a norm today, and we attribute it to climate change. We also know that industrialization is something which we can't avoid, whether it is development of India or any other country, and none of us can return back to the Stone Age. And therefore, we have to live with the impact, or rather what we say, that industrialization will continue, but how to make it green. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all for this deliberation, and I'll put it this way. We are not just looking at the release of this important publication. We are actually looking towards your suggestions and ideas and contribute in the discussion, because this is something without which the humankind cannot survive on this planet. At COP26 in Glasgow, way back in 21, Honorable Prime Minister made the landmark announcement that India would become net zero by 2070. Why I'm calling it a landmark announcement is because India is one of the few countries, or rather a unique country, where we have challenge of having young workforce for whom we have to create employment. It's also, while I call it a challenge, it's also an opportunity. And opportunity is that when we say made in India, we industrialize. And that essentially means in terms of emissions, we are going to emit much more. Proudly, we say per unit emissions in India is amongst the lowest, but will they really remain that low in years to come? Because as our economic situation improves, the first thing we love to invest on, and rightly so, is energy. So whether it is in terms of automobiles, whether it is having air conditioners at home for your comfort and so on, the energy consumption is bound to go up. And therefore, to say where we still haven't peaked in terms of emissions, to take this pledge that by 2070 we are going to be net zero is a very bold step. And in a way, Prime Minister could make that commitment because he had faith in his citizens, that they will come up to the mark and they all will work towards his vision, or the country's vision of Viksit Bharat or developed India, where focus is on inclusive and sustainable growth. As we navigate India's trajectory towards sustainable development, it is imperative to recognize our national pivotal position as an emerging economy with vast potential for growth. It's already, we have started seeing that there is a sort of entrepreneurship development that made in India, that is what the unicorns, the maximum number of unicorns emerging in India, and that again is a very positive step. We aspire to meet the dual objective of becoming a developed economy while reducing the carbon intensity of the economy and achieving net zero by 2070. And informally, in many forums, while we are discussing this particular subject, they say wait and see. It won't be 2070, perhaps it's going to be 2047. And as the new technologies are emerging, and if there is success with hydrogen mission and so on, maybe this date will be much earlier and not later. As I said, while our energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions are expected to rise, we are committed to charting a course towards a net zero by 2070. It's a tall order, but India is committed to achieve its target in years to come. We took the lead in setting up of a task force in TERI to work towards the journey to net zero. And this paper, India's Journey to Net Zero, Conceptual Framework for Analysis, examines the transition journey for each of the major GHG emitting sectors in the country. This discussion study presents a framework for peaking of emissions and subsequent decline through the lens of delinking growth from an increase in carbon emissions. This is an initial exercise for presenting a conceptual framework for analysis. And the intent is to begin a dialogue on what is involved in achieving the net zero ambition. In this discussion study, the authors have also identified in-depth studies and analysis and generations of scenarios, and this would aid in strategic interventions for our near-term and long-term plans. We believe that net zero target has challenges, and as I said earlier, challenges are challenges as long as you take them as challenges, but they provide you with opportunities and perhaps collaboration among all stakeholders, and not within the country, I'll say overseas expertise also in different subjects, partnerships, which needs to be brought out if we want to succeed. And we welcome your invaluable thoughts and suggestions. And as she introduced, we are TERI as an institute, we are in our 50th year. Next month, we'll be completing 50 years of our existence. And I'm very proud to say that we are fulfilling the objective with which TERI was established. Of course, 50 years is a long time, and I'll say now we know what path to follow. And I'm sure the next 50 years will be much, much faster growth for TERI and for the country, and perhaps for the planet, where we are looking for sustainability as mantra if humankind has to survive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for those inspiring words. I now invite the authors of the discussion paper to make the presentation. Mr. Ajay Shankar, Distinguished Fellow, TERI, Dr. Sanjit Saran Agarwal, Associate Fellow, and Ms. Taruna Idnani, Project Manager, Corporate Actions.
Now the author should come in front. Come. He's not here? Okay, perfect.
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Vibha Damanji, for those opening remarks. We decided we'll come to the presentation straight away, and then we have the chairman who will address us after the presentation. So this is India's journey to net zero by 2070. It's a framework for conceptual framework for analysis. So the intention is to generate discussion and interest and analysis of what that journey would entail. It is nobody's case that is going to be easy, or that there is not a series of formidable challenges that would need to be overcome. But India has been showing extraordinary climate leadership. So at COP26, we made two major announcements: 500 GW of non-fuel capacity creation by 2030 and achieving net zero by 2070. The 500 GW non-fossil fuel capacity creation program is under implementation. So we felt that it is now the right time to begin discussion and analysis about what the journey to net zero would involve. So this is the right time to begin thinking about it, though 2070 appears very far off. And by and large, we are focused on achieving what is needed to get to 500 GW by 2030. As DG said in her remarks, that we have twin objectives now. One is to become a developed economy. And I would say that in the paper, we have assumed that we will sooner or later become a developed economy and we'll at least have European levels of income and consumption. And we have at the same time to achieve net zero by 2070. So we have dual goals. Now, the only way this can be achieved is by decoupling of growth from increase in carbon emissions. So that's the crux of the matter. So for each major carbon emitting sector, we need a strategy for decoupling of growth from increase in emissions and thereafter decline of emissions. So two stages. One is peaking of emissions in a sector and then decline of emissions. Now, if emissions have come down ultimately to zero, then the earlier decoupling of growth from increase in emissions would reduce the cost of bringing emissions down to net zero. This is the key. The implication of this is that investment in creating capital intensive, carbon emitting projects need to factor in the cost of retirement ultimately for achieving net zero. Now, we've just tried to put a couple of pictures to make it easier for us to understand what the implication of this. So in any sector and cumulatively for the economy, the rate of increase of emissions can vary. It can be faster or slower. The emission intensity of the GDP can fall slowly or faster. Now, we have been fortunate in focusing on energy efficiency and have done a reasonably good job in reducing the emission intensity. So the first graph explains that and makes it easier to understand. So the rate of increase in emissions becomes lower with decreasing carbon intensity, and decoupling occurs when additional growth is carbon-free. Now, this is true for the economy as a whole and for each sector. Now, once decoupling happens or peaking takes place, emissions can stay at a plateau for a long time or for a shorter time. And then the decline can happen sharply or slowly. So that's the key. And in this paper, we have looked at major sectors, but we've looked at them in a very broad macro way and suggested or identified the issues or areas on which more detailed studies are required. So we've looked at electricity, we've looked at sectors where pathway is clear and follows the greening of electricity or electricity becoming carbon-free. These two today are clearly surface transport and cooking. Then we have the area which is tough, where there is great uncertainty, not only in India, but the rest of the world, and that's why they're called hard to abate sectors, where decarbonization pathway is not yet clear. These are industry, shipping, aviation, and India agriculture. With this, I'll request my colleague Taruna to run through the slides on electricity.
So, as we know that electricity production emissions in India today are 1,240 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is equivalent to 40% of India's total emissions. And as of today, carbon-free generation in the power mix is 21%. carbon intensity would decline with reducing share of thermal generation. So as the thermal generation would reduce, the carbon intensity would decline. Rapid increase in storage would make new thermal plants unnecessary. So as the renewables share of renewables is growing, there is also a case of storage. So renewable plus storage would make new thermal plants unnecessary. And as of today, renewable plus storage is cheaper than new thermal. No additional cost in decoupling of emissions from increased production in this sector is envisaged. So once we reach the peak, emissions can stay at a plateau and it can gradually decline, or emissions can then decline gradually or steeply, depending on the pace of retirement of thermal plants. So once the emissions would peak for the electricity sector, they would remain at a plateau. The plateau could be shorter or a longer, depending on the pace of retirement of thermal plants. Then we would subsequently move towards decline. It would involve costs. Cost of retirement includes loss of royalty, closure of coal mines and thermal plants, and job losses. Costs can be offset by repurposing of land. So the land resources which are there in the cash-rich companies could be utilized and costs can be offset by repurposing of land. Following studies are suggested for the electricity sector. Modeling exercises for installation of RE and large grid scale storage for reaching the inflection point when reliable supply for additional demand would not need new thermal capacity. And in the medium to long term, we also envisage that nuclear capacity is going to play a role in carbon-free generation. So feasible pace of creating new nuclear capacity, trajectory of feasible cost reduction. Then third, preparing a strategy for transition of Coal India, NDCs, or other thermal companies into green fossil fuel-free energy companies. Assessing the cost of just transition. Then studies and pilot projects for repurposing of land of exhausted coal mine. Now I would invite Dr. Sanchit to present surface transport.
The transport emissions in India are about 315 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which are about 10% of India's emissions. In the road transportation, decoupling would occur when all new vehicles would become electric and new heavy-duty trucks start using green hydrogen. The decline in emissions would begin immediately at the pace at which the existing vehicles retire normally. In railways, the emissions are 6.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which are about 2% of the transport emissions. Railways have already given a net zero target of 2030, which involves electrification of railways, both passenger and freight, the phasing out of diesel engines. The electricity consumed by railways also have to be carbon free by 2030, and the use of captive solar power generation and green energy open access would help in achieving the railway's net zero target. The study suggested the various scenarios on EV penetration of having the dominant market share of EVs and then the complete market share. Accordingly, the strategy for creating adequate public charging infrastructure, technical and commercial implications of converting roads into electric highways. In cooking, electricity is cheaper than gas for cooking. For decarbonization of cooking, promotion of electric cooking is the key driver. The challenge remains with the consumer's acceptance of electricity for cooking, and biogas is an alternative renewable source of energy, provided that there is a robust, scalable business model. Industry is one of the hard to abate sectors. The three pillars of industrial decarbonization identified are switching from fossil fuels to green electrification, promoting solar thermal for low and medium temperature heating, use of green hydrogen instead of fossil fuels in industries like fertilizer, steel, and chemicals. For industry, the decoupling of growth from carbon emissions is a difficult challenge due to higher costs of low carbon or carbon-free production. Pilot projects to be implemented for lower carbon, carbon-free production for each industry. India should aim to reach the global frontier in having technical capacity to decarbonize in different industries. The National Hydrogen Mission is a significant step in this direction. After cost discovery through the pilot projects, strategy for decoupling of emissions could be evolved. Reducing emissions in the industry would be more challenging, and policy for reducing emissions to emerge after decoupling. Shipping is another hard to abate sector, which has about 3 million tons of CO2 equivalent, about 1% of the transport emissions in the country. The pilot projects for substitution of fossil fuels for decarbonization of shipping includes green hydrogen as direct use of green ammonia, and biofuels. Now, the discovery of costs once these pilot projects are implemented will determine the preferred route for decarbonization. Now, for agriculture, I would request Aruna again.
For the agriculture sector, total non-energy agriculture emissions today in India are 420 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which are equivalent to 13% of India's total emissions. And internationally, reducing methane emissions is a high priority as it is a low-hanging fruit. The key strategies that we have suggested in this paper include design and implement policy for full use of cow dung for commercial energy, like reducing methane emissions. Design and implement policy for the use of all crop waste into useful commercial energy, like using pellets from crop waste for thermal power plants as a substitute for coal. And the use of cow dung, crop waste, and agriculture waste as a renewable energy source would lead to reduction in emissions as well as increase in rural incomes. Improved agriculture practices for rice cultivation would again lead to reduction in methane emissions. For the conclusion, I would request Ajay Shankar sir to present the conclusion.
The paper would be available online, so request people to go through it. But when we began this exercise, we were a little hesitant because we thought that reaching net zero is very difficult and maybe these issues should be addressed 10-15 years down the road with seriousness. But we thought it is better to begin the exercise now. And I am glad to say that we found that the task is not as daunting or as difficult as we thought it would be when we began. So the peaking of emissions from electricity appears feasible at no additional cost. Now, this is quite a pleasant conclusion. So the cost would be involved only when we want to close down the existing thermal capacity. And there again, unlike the Western countries, because land is so valuable in India, we see the use of the land that is released from coal mines and thermal plants as generating high income. Whether that high income is enough to meet the costs or more than what is required to meet the cost or low would be discovered as we go along and make intelligent plans for reuse of land. And we have in the main paper suggested that there are some mines which have already been closed down or are closing down, and some pilot efforts at studying and reuse of that land should begin. Now, the other point which I made in the beginning is worth reiterating, that reduction of emissions from electricity generation would have a cost. But the cost would be lower the sooner emissions peak. Therefore, the sooner we achieve enough storage to get the confidence that renewable plus storage can meet additional demand, the sooner we would have peaked and lower would be the cost of closure of thermal plants and mines. Now, transport and cooking can switch to electricity, and there is cost reduction immediately, because cooking from electricity is cheaper. Using electricity for driving EVs is cheaper. I mean, recent trends in the market have demonstrated that. The tender on electric buses has shown that per kilometer cost of running an electric bus is lower than a diesel bus. So it's just a question of accelerating the transition. So cooking and transport become carbon free along with the decarbonization of electricity. So here we see no cost in decarbonization of electricity till peaking and some cost thereafter. And in cooking and transport, we see costs coming down. This is a very pleasant conclusion. And as emissions from electricity reach zero and all transport becomes green, about 50% of our emissions would get eliminated. So this gives considerable confidence and optimism about the journey to ultimate net zero. Now, the hard to abate sectors are challenging. They're challenging for us, they're challenging for the rest of the world. But if we take up pilot projects soon under the green hydrogen mission, we would get clarity of the costs involved in each of the hard to abate sectors of having a carbon-free or a very reduced carbon production. And once the costs emerge, then it is easier to take a rational view of how to scale up, what policy instruments to use. And these are issues which need to be addressed after the pilot projects are in position. But it would be useful to consider the policy instruments, because at the end of the day, if there is a higher cost, it can be mitigated either by getting the consumer to pay more or for the government to pay more. But the more critical thing is how to move down the cost curve very rapidly. And we have had two extraordinary success stories in the country. One is in solar power and the other is LED. So when we move forward in the hard to abate sectors, we would need to keep these two policy learnings in mind as we grapple with the issues. Now, we have in the paper suggested detailed sectoral studies, modeling for alternative scenarios, cost projections, and these would need to be updated because we are in a world where technology moves rapidly, costs change very rapidly. So unless there is enough frequency in which these scenarios are built and costs are done, we tend to get dated. So we believe that in each of these sectors that we have recommended detailed studies, these studies would need to be revised and updated based on experience. And I do hope what DG referred to is that in 10, 15 years down the line, we get the confidence to think of 2047 for becoming net zero. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, Taruna and Dr. Sanchit, for the detailed presentation on the paper. I request the online audience to post their questions in the chat box, which we'll take up in the subsequent Q&A session. We now have the address by Chairman Terry, Dr. Mr. Nitin Desai. I request sir to please deliver his remarks.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, good. Well, let me just congratulate the three of you who have produced this report on something which is very useful. And of course, it's a starting point. There'll be continuous work that we will have to do in this area. What I would just like to add to what the discussions that we have is that in many ways, the focus these days is very much on decoupling the growth in supply from carbon emissions. Whether it's increased supply of energy, whether it's industrial products, agricultural products, or whatever. What I would like to add to your work is we should also pay attention to how do you decouple demand growth from carbon emission. Let me give a couple of examples. One of the things that you're going to face, particularly in urban areas, with rising temperature, because even if you stay at 1.5 degrees, the temperature is going to go up, is more cooling requirements in urban areas. Now, one of the things you can do is to reduce that by redesigning your buildings so that they do not necessarily require as much of cooling, energy for cooling, as they do today. In fact, there is a national program on cooling. I go a step further. I said you may need to look at urban design itself. We spoke of transportation, putting in electric vehicles instead of petroleum. But we should also ask ourselves, how can I reduce the demand for transportation? In the way in which my cities are designed, one could also look at it in terms of the broader picture. Let me give a nice example since we were sitting there, is that nano fertilizers will reduce the demand for heavy fertilizers, which have a lot of transportation requirement. In some ways, nano fertilizers reduces transport requirements also, but let's leave that to one side. I think more generally, one of the areas that I would add to the work that we do is urban design. That in many ways, redesigning our cities so that we cope with the changing temperatures, etc., and in designing them so that we reduce the demands for things like cooling, for things like transportation. We would also look at things like making cities green and so on. So I'd say that that's one the demand side. The other demand side you should also look at is on the industrial products. For instance, cement. Cement is used to make concrete, which you use for building. But it is possible to reduce the demand for cement for concrete by bringing in other things like fly ash and so on. Of course, you'll have less fly ash because you won't be burning coal, but there are other things that you can bring in. And in one of the areas in cement which is receiving attention is how do I reduce cement demand for concrete in itself. But there are other areas, steel. In many ways, steel, which essentially recycles steel and converts it into the new steel that you want to use, is less energy intensive than producing steel from iron ore. So there are things on the demand side that I would urge that we have a closer look at. Now, I think you've done very well in terms of identifying the areas where we need to do advanced work. For instance, you've very correctly pointed out, there are certain things like cement where you can never reduce it to zero. And you will have to bring in the sufficient capacity to look into carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Incidentally, one of the areas that you have mentioned in your note is the possibility this may be needed even in agriculture. That really, there will rice production or animal husbandry, there's no possibility of reducing GHGs to zero. And you have actually mentioned that. So I don't know how exactly that would work. So I'd say that let's see whether we can bring in some understanding from the demand side. What this really leads to is that our issues here are partly technology issues. How do I design things which will use electricity or use green hydrogen, etc.? That's certainly very valuable. But I think we also need to look at policy issues. How do I get people to actually pay attention to this. It's understandable we pay attention because we are an environmental organization in some sense. But how do I persuade the industries to look into this more carefully? And this is where policy comes in. Now, I don't want to go into details of this policy, but take one example, carbon pricing. If I have carbon pricing, it will be an incentive to reduce the utilization of carbon emitting inputs, etc. And it will affect both the demand side as well as the supply side. The guys producing steel will be a little more careful in how much they use because they'll have to pay for the carbon emissions. The guys who are using certain methods of cooking will have to see will be affected by the fact that, let's say, use of LPG will be subject to a higher carbon price than the use of renewable energy produced electricity and so on. So we need to look at these. My final point that I would want to bring out, that in many areas, like particularly agriculture, we cannot separate mitigation and reaching the net zero thing from adaptation and resilience. We may need an integrated strategy which looks at all three dimensions: mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases, the adaptation to the reality of climate change, which we will have to face, even if the world succeeds on keeping it to 1.5 degrees, and resilience because of the growing uncertainties that people will face. Agriculture is the most obvious thing, but we may also need it in areas like our coastal cities and so on. So I'd say this is a very valuable beginning, and it should certainly be pursued. I hope we can get industry to collaborate in some of these. You're right that at this stage in industry, it is mainly a matter of some degree of work by them in developing the technologies required for the transition. I see that some of it is happening, at least in steel and in one or two other areas. And I also see a growing interest in industry in getting into this. But we need to push them through policy. We need to push them a little harder to work in this area. I'm also very happy that you pointed out that the more we delay the process, the higher you will reach and the bigger drop you'll have to experience in terms of carbon emissions. So it is better to start sooner rather than later. The future is going to be that of safer technologies from an environmental perspective. And I would urge that we work on this and push this agenda. So let me once again congratulate you on a wonderful piece of work. And I do hope that when we continue with our work on net zero, because what you're doing is very important. Net zero is only a target. It doesn't tell you anything. How you get to net zero is far more important than the date for net zero. That is and I'm happy that we are starting to work on this in India, and we are actually trying to draw a time profile of how do I get from here to net zero by 2070. So many thanks, and I look forward to more work in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for those inspiring words. We now open the floor for a question and answer round. We'll take a couple of quick questions from the in-person audience and then move on to a couple of online questions as well.
This is G. There's finances for this. Because if I give an example, spoke about decarbonizing the transport sector. We have roughly 1.5 million businesses in the country.
Please bring the mic a little closer.
We have roughly 1.22 million businesses in the country. And so far, the efforts to raise finances has not been as expected because of the stretched financial profile of the state transport corporations. So does and as it comes out in various discussions between academia and the government, finances are the Achilles heel. So does the study also look at finances? Because one avenue suggested is green bonds. But we have not been able to raise as much as should be. In FY24, we raised roughly 20,000 crores. In FY23, we were roughly 16,000 crores. So, the efforts to decarbonize stall when we look at finances and we are stagnant. How do you look at that aspect of it?
Financing is very important and important for every segment. And we have not gone into financing in this paper. And that is an area which needs studies and papers sector by sector. An area which needs studies sector by sector. But I'll make two broad points going by past experience. The key to financing and looking at the issue of financing is to look at policy, and the policy framework should become such that private capital can flow into projects. And the issue of higher cost, if any, is met through policy instruments. So I'll give you the example of the National Solar Mission. Now, National Solar Mission began with the goal of 22,000 megawatts. It appeared impossible because the price of solar power was 16, 17 rupees a unit. The smart policy that was evolved was that investment in solar projects was completely de-risked by inviting bids, awarding contracts at whatever the price that was discovered in the market. And the financing of these projects were de-risked by these long-term contracts. So first year, the contracts were about 12 rupees, now they've come down to 2.5 rupees. So flow of equity and debt for solar power in India till date has not been an issue. So going to any other sector, policymakers have to see how do I create a business case for investment, de-risk that investment, and handle the other issues through regulation, through subsidy, cross-subsidy or whatever. Because the Indian economy today is integrated with the global economy as far as financing is concerned. So flow of money to a project where investment has been de-risked and returns are clear is not a problem in India. So going forward in this sector, the challenge would be for policymakers to design a strategy and a policy instruments where private investment becomes viable. And the remarkable thing about India is that the entire investment in renewable energy has been private sector, by the private sector. And that is why we have such an extraordinary success story. So there's a big lesson there.
So one last question.
Please.
How much did we have an estimation of how much is that old land which can be utilized? Because several core PSUs are working, MNC India is working on.
No, there are, I think, 50, 60,000 hectares. And if you look at the industrial landscape in India, industrial mills in Bombay have moved out. That land is a gold mine and has been used as a gold mine. So if you have the right policy, and again, look at Delhi. 50 years back, the cheapest land in Delhi or around Delhi was south of the Qutub because it was useless agricultural land. The most valuable land was north of Delhi. But because we were able to get smart, combination of circumstances, the most valuable land in India is in that useless land 50 years back in the DLF Qutub area in Gurgaon. So well-imagined, well-designed policies over time can give you a lot of returns from land. And that is what we have emphasized in this paper, because when we look at the rest of the world, land has no great value. So there is genuine anxiety that if a coal mine closes down, what will happen? And huge number of people working in coal mines have suffered enormously with the closure of mines in UK. Ali.
Sir, thank you very much. First of all, heavy congratulations to you and to the team put it together. I note that this is a conceptual framework for analysis. It's not a place for an answer. And in fact, that's what you put down. So, what happens is that what most of us are thinking are answers. And that's a different matter, and each of us will talk to you. I want to draw your attention to two or three things. One is financing. The other is the demand side, as the chairman mentioned, which is, I think, a very important element of even a conceptual relation. But more than that, I want to draw your attention to something else, which you mentioned in your opening remarks. But then, the standard issues of supply side mitigation really have taken over, which is understandable. And that is the question of Viksit Bharat in 1947. And let's not go into earlier and smaller. What is it that would need? And what is it that you can do towards Viksit Bharat in 2047, which is decoupled from emissions growth? Now, this is not an easy subject, but frankly, I would say that, we as environmentalists, when we put out a report, perfectly fine to say net zero by 2070, and we are addressing that. Nothing wrong in that. But think about that in various ways. If you can also have a subtext and Viksit Bharat in 2047, because that's the important element. Net zero will achieve, there's various ways of achieving it. Look at the COVID years. You switched off everything and you'll have it. So, whether it's the talk of decoupling or deindustrialization, these ideas are exactly similar. In fact, sir, it's worth noting what the Europeans are saying now. They're simply putting up their hands and saying, sorry, we have Ukraine, national security is important, democracy is important, this, that, and the other. And therefore, just turn your backs. That's what is happening. It's not just shirking responsibilities, but actually, shirking on one side, but shifting responsibilities on the other. And in that context, we need to do something. And I think this is a very valuable suggestion, especially at the time at which it has been. So let me just say thank you very much for that. Very honored to be here and be part of TERI in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Your suggestions are very important, and we'll certainly try and look at the 2047. But one point I'd like to make, and in the paper we have made it very clearly, which is that we have assumed that India will reach EU levels of consumption sooner or later. The earlier, the better. And therefore, net zero has to be seen through the prism of having European levels of per capita income and consumption. Excellent. Because we live in a globalized world, we've seen that if SUVs are popular in America, they're popular in India. We can privately say all kinds of things. So we have assumed that we have to get to net zero, even if consumption rises a lot. The consumption should rise less. I'm all for it. But in the real world, let us accept that it will rise, and how do I get to net zero? And how do I do that with the least cost? So one point I made in the opening slide was that all investments in carbon emitting plants must factor in the cost of ultimate retirement. And as an economy in each sector and in government, we start to change the way in which we look at investment decisions by bringing in the prism of ultimate retirement also as a factor, which is not there at all.
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful study. But two questions. One is in continuation to what sir said, and another is on generally electricity is seen as the answer for all the problems, right? That if we electrify everything, do we have a number that, for net zero, how much electricity consumption are we talking about? I heard in Vasudha Foundation.
Let me respond straight away. In the paper, please read it. We have said that if our per capita consumption is the equivalent of Europe today, that is the total electricity generation that we are looking at.
How much?
You look at the numbers in the paper, I won't give it to you, but it's huge. So therefore, the earliest decoupling of increase in electricity production from carbon emission is of paramount importance, and that's the cheapest way to meet our electricity demand. Okay. That's the key takeaway from data that has emerged, which we have highlighted in other papers also and in this paper also.
Okay.
So you can meet full demand, additional demand, without thermal power, provided you have achieved enough storage. And we have produced papers on storage which show that it can be done and done on scale. So the only challenge is to have storage come up as rapidly as solar projects came up to get the confidence in a few years that additional demand can be fully met with renewables and storage. And we have also mentioned nuclear because in the long run, nuclear has to play a more important role, and the rest of the world is also beginning to recognize that.
Okay. The second question is, taking this point forward, how can we make net zero our next engine of growth? So rather than
let me answer that. There is a lot of debate going on about the European, taxes being imposed on import of products depending on the embedded carbon. I have personally argued elsewhere that we should welcome it because this will allow us to create green manufacturing capacity which can enter the European market without duties. And this has the least cost for us because we don't have those manufacturing capacities to cater to the European market. All those capacities are in China. Now the Chinese have the additional cost of closing their plants. The same point I made here, that the earlier you peak, the lower is the cost of retirement. So they have the challenge of closing those plants because industrial production retrofitting to achieve low carbon is difficult. Just as you can't get low carbon from an old Ambassador car, you have to sell it and buy a more energy efficient Maruti. So we have a historic opportunity to becoming the factory of the world if we take to low carbon manufacturing at great speed and start thinking of 15, 20 years and not 4 or 5 years. Yeah, one more. And then we go to the audience.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Congratulate the team. Observation that in the presentation you have mentioned that electricity, the cooking sector electricity is cheaper than LPG or gas. But still it is, that electricity has some value. The price has to be paid by the consumers. And in the rural sector, consumers are mostly used firewood and twigs almost at the free without any cost. So do you think that it is possible to 100% electric cooking?
Let me respond. Some states are beginning to give free electricity to households. So you can cook without cost. The Prime Minister has announced 1 crore rooftop solar panels. Now, I don't see it stopping at 1 crore because once 1 crore is implemented, politics will drive 100% coverage of weaker sections. So the challenge, as we have highlighted in the paper, is getting the consumer or the user to become comfortable with using only electricity for cooking. That is not the case in India today. But the fact is the whole of Europe people use only electricity. And I have lived there and can cook very good Indian food, including chapatis with electricity.
And then in case of India, there is two things. One, that providing free electricity will not resolve the problem.
But it is also cheaper than gas, by the way, which is also.
But for cooking, at least you need other utensils and all. And
sure. So there are challenges. I'm not saying that.
And food habit also in the case of India, because fuel stacking is an option in the case of India.
May I have some questions from those joined online?
So I'll just read out a couple.
You can read from somewhere there in the dial response because I can't read from here.
So I'll read out a couple of online questions and you can answer them.
Yeah.
The first one is on circular economy. Do you see the possibility for circular economy principles to support or fast track the path towards net zero?
Okay, let's take two more.
Yeah. The next one is on the need for finance. So it mentions, while the need for finance is mentioned, do you see need for taxonomy framework for impact finance?
Okay.
And after that, we have a question on, despite the lack of adequate infrastructure necessary for an effective energy transition, how do you see the implementation of a state energy efficiency action plan addressing the efficient use of energy resources and limiting carbon emissions?
Okay. The financing issue I've already answered earlier. Net zero is a breakthrough in creating a circular energy economy. Getting a circular economy in other industrial areas would become easier to the extent we succeed in net zero. But that's a separate kind of challenge. And I think the sooner we take it up in India, the better it is. And in terms of energy efficiency, I think we can be quite proud of what we have achieved in the last 20, 25 years. The Bureau of Energy Efficiency, their whole PAT program, the results are truly impressive. And it remains an important goal, and programs are ongoing. Another set of 3 questions.
Can you scroll down? No, the next one. Can you scroll down? For hard-to-abate sector, issues related to technology transfer, capacity building, and intellectual property rights, barriers needs to be addressed. I think
Let me answer this straight away. The hard fact is that technology is developed by private firms. There are IPR issues, and the global community has not been able to take a deep breath and say that we will appropriate the IPR and transfer it free. But the fact of the matter is that IPR costs are a minuscule cost of the final product once you get large volumes. And once you get large volumes, the price also comes down dramatically. So I believe that we should do our pilot projects, which is what we have recommended, with whatever technology is available in the world, and technology owners would be delighted to have a market. And once we do our first pilot project, then we would be in a position to take a call on how to move forward. In fact, owners of technology may be happy to give licensing arrangements, joint ventures or whatever. And we can also spend money and buy out the firms. Many Indian firms are actually buying out technology companies in the rest of the world, and I hope more of that happens. So I would start with the premise that whatever technology is available in the world is available at a price which we can afford for pilot projects, and we will do pilot projects and learn to do it cheaper than anybody else in the world.
we just have one final question from the online audience. How India and other countries should align their short-term goals from emissions minimization to long-term goals of achieving or reduction of carbon footprint?
As I said, we have to get to net zero. The sooner we get to net zero, the lower is the NPV cost of getting to net zero. And this paper is focused on India, and I genuinely believe that in this world, we have to follow that Ikla Chalo line. We have to do what we can do, what we are capable of doing, and we are capable of doing as much as anybody else in the world. So it's the India-centric paper, and I think India-centric work and forward movement in the industrial side may finally give us the breakthrough in becoming a great exporter of manufactured goods, a goal which has been eluding us till date. So I think it's a convergence of national interest in having green industry and also becoming a major industrial power for the world and becoming an exporter of green goods. So we can leapfrog to becoming a global green goods manufacturing hub or the green factory of the world where China is today. But it needs a lot of thinking, ambition, and strategy.
We also have Mr. Aniruddha Kumar, former Additional Secretary, MNRE, who would like to make a comment.
Please.
So can you please unmute yourself?
Good afternoon, sir. I am Aniruddha Kumar. I was Joint Secretary, Ministry of Power for 5 years, and thereafter I was Additional Secretary in MNRE. And currently I chaired a task force set up by Ministry of Steel to decarbonize the manufacturing of steel. And now presently I am a part of the committee set up by Forum of Regulators, Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, who are framing model regulations for green energy open access. So I just like to share my findings or outcome of those studies. And in fact, Terry was our knowledge partner. So you would have all the documents and the reports with you. So the finding in steel sector was that if we substitute part of the fossil fuel energy or grid energy by green energy, then it was cost positive. Only thing is that we have to handle the consumer, that is a small steel manufacturer, that how to procure that green electricity from the open access consumer. So there is a concept of open access, which I believe most of the people would know, where you can directly buy green energy from the generators. Otherwise, you have to buy the energy from the grid only, the discoms only. But the recently, Ministry of Power came out in June 2022, the Green Energy Open Access Rules, and which are a very positive development. They encourage the green energy open access directly by consumers from the generators. So that could be a game changer. So Forum of Regulator is also mulling or deliberating how to frame forum of regulation. So my suggestion would be if TERI could take up this awareness campaign as well as handle various industries. Because the problem, suggestion number one in our report was the capacity building of the smaller or mid-scale manufacturers of steel to how to procure them, to handle them, to provide technical support to them, to provide procurement support to them. So that could be a very, very potential area if TERI can take up this activity, and I'll be very happy to support you for that. I volunteer to offer my services of course, on part-time basis.
Thank you. Thank you. We value your comments and look forward to being able to work with you.
Sure, sir. And you have my phone number and I am available.
Do we have any more questions from our in-person audience?
Thank you, sir, for this very wonderful presentation and outline about thinking about where we might go. I had questions related to demand side and financing, but they have already been asked and answered. So, so it's an observation now that I think there are a number of behavioral assumptions in what you have presented. So we expect industry to, behave in a certain positive manner. We also expect the policymakers to, meet that behavioral change, and also the consumers. But behavioral change also requires a bit of policy and market development and so on. So what are your thoughts on that?
Simple answer, it's not easy. And discussions like this, as they percolate and others begin thinking and talking about it, some societal consensus begins to emerge, which then drives policy, which drives decision making, and one can see very good results in a short period. And we can also see examples of failures which are disastrous. And I'll end by saying that the failures in the West and the advanced countries on climate change are disastrous. Thank you.
We had an engaging round of discussion. I now invite Mr. G. Seth, Senior Director, TERI, to give the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Apurva. So I think this was an excellent piece of work. I can just simply say that, first of all, I would like to thank Mr. Rajesh Shankar. I think he really led from the front. In fact, he was pushing us all to come and write something on this subject. And we actually, all of us, I think, of course, I can say that I didn't do anything much on it, but I think it was the team led by Mr. Rajesh Shankar with Sanchit, Taruna, and quite a few other colleagues from across TERI, I think, who have contributed. And I would just like to mention, I think this is perhaps one of the first outputs of what is actually a task force in the structure of TERI, task force on net zero, which was created by Dr. Vibha Dhawan last year. And this is an example of how we all can come together and come up with papers or ideas which can be taken forward. And I think, to me personally, I think, of course, the conceptual framework, as far as you have outlined, is an excellent work moving up, and then how we can move down in terms of the rate and the growth. But I think equally important are those triggers and the ideas which have come up in each of these segments on the further studies, in-depth studies, which we would like to undertake as a part of the further work as a part of this task force. I think the things like what Shashwata mentioned, the issues, what you mentioned on the behavioral issues, I think the typical points which you mentioned about how we can cook a chapati on a electric stove. So those are the kind of things, the in-depth studies, maybe surveys and awareness programs would be needed, I think, as we move forward. And of course, many in-depth studies. I would also just like to point out also that I think one is, of course, on the policy side, and the way one has to move forward, looking at this conceptual framework. And I would also like to mention, I think that just a few weeks back, I think Niti Aayog has created I think 6 working groups across all the sectors which are going to work on net zero. And luckily, Terry is part of at least 4 or 5 of these working groups, including the sectoral groups. Also on the macroeconomic issues, I think you are a part of it, Mr. Rashmi, and I think Manish is a part of it. We also have a working group which is talking about the social issues related to transition to a net zero. I think Jayant is a part of it. So there quite a few of Terry colleagues can take these ideas which have come up in this document to the larger body, which is ETO, which is going to take it further. And secondly, also, I think to me, the other important stakeholder in this whole work is actually the corporate sector. Policies are one side of the story, the regulations are another side of the story. But I think ultimately the action has to be taken primarily by the private sector. And that way, I think we at TERI have taken one step ahead, I think, with the help of the CBS, and we created this near zero charter on net zero, or near zero, I think. We call it industry charter on near zero emissions. And we have close to around, I think, 80 or 90 different corporates from across the different segments who are a part of this. I think we have tried to put a small paragraph about that in the document as well. And I think that's something which we should be utilizing it more often to really sensitize the corporate sector, learn from them, and take this document to the larger audience, whether it's the large industries or the small and medium industries or different segments of the Indian economy. And this is all what I would like to say. So thanks once again, I think, to you, sir, and also I think Mr. Desai for referring to this whole subject of demand side, I think, which presently has not come. We at TERI, at least, we have been trying to work with the example which Mr. Desai, you mentioned about the cement sector. I think how the demand can be reduced in the net zero document, which we are trying to prepare for the cement and the concrete sector, how we can reduce the demand for cement in construction and also the steel in the construction. That has come out significantly in that document. Of course, I think it talks about almost 20 to 30% reduction in the demand for these materials. It's possible through various stakeholder consultations. So thanks all of you who have joined. This document, I think, is available online. And we, of course, will be getting comments from everybody, from not just from TERI, but from outside TERI as well. And thanks once again, everybody.